I will never again take air conditioning for granted. Those of you who are chuckling probably know that is because I preach at Morton Chapel first, and we do not have it there. So I'm just hoping to make it, from there to here without having to change shirts. That is my prayer every summer Sunday morning. There was this one time that some friends of ours were on their way to church with their kids, and they were running a little bit behind schedule. And it's always when you're a little bit behind that suddenly you come to a complete standstill because of construction or something like that. And they had encountered unexpected, were stopped on the highway, and Lyle said to the family, "Did somebody pray for patience this morning?" Little Baker in back seat. I did. "I told you not to pray for patience." God will give you an opportunity to practice it if you pray for patience, I do not think that God is offended by our laughter. After all, God is quite the jokester, and you're supposed to laugh at jokes. That's why, to me, it is sometimes frustrating the way that we read and interpret Scripture, and there's this one instance, especially in Genesis, that really gets me, because we often refer to this in a very negative way. In Genesis chapter 18 is where I'm going to be reading in a moment, but I should back up and let you know who we're talking about here. The couple, the great ancestors, and Sarah. Now, they began as Abram and Sarai, and God called them, specifically called Abram to pack up everything and everybody in his whole entire household and move, and said, "I'll give you the address on the way." So they just packed up and left. This had been a challenging journey. And God promised on a number of occasions to Abraham, in fact, the one in which God said, "You will now be Abraham, and your wife's name will be Sarah, because you will be the parents of a great many descendants," which Abraham at first was puzzled about, given the fact that he had no children. He and Sarah could have no children, they believed. And so Abraham had been reminded of this promise on occasion, but it had been many, many years. In chapter 18, we learn of this instance. "The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre, while he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat." I think we can resonate, envision ourselves there. "He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to greet them and bowed deeply. He said, 'Sirs, if you would be so kind, don't just pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought so you may wash your feet and refresh yourselves under the tree. Let me offer you a little bread so you will feel stronger, and after that you may leave your servant and go on your way, since you have visited your servant." They responded, "Fine, do just as you have said." So Abraham hurried to Sarah at his tent and said, "Hurry, knead 3 seahs of the finest flour and make some baked goods." Abraham ran to the cattle, took a healthy young calf, and gave it to a young servant who prepared it quickly. Then Abraham took butter, milk, and the calf that had been prepared, put the food in front of them, and stood under the tree near them as they ate. They said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Right here in the tent." Then one of the men said, "I will definitely return to you about this time next year. Then your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were both very old. Sarah was no longer menstruating, so Sarah laughed to herself. "I'm no longer able to have children, and my husband's old." The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Too difficult for the Lord? When I return to you about this time next year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied and said, "I didn't laugh," because she was frightened. But he said, "No, you laughed." Then, if we look over to chapter 21, we see that the Lord was attentive to Sarah just as he had said, and the Lord carried out just what he had promised her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham when he was old, at the very time God had told them. Abraham named his son, the one Sarah bore him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, just as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, "God has given me laughter. Everyone who hears about it will laugh with me." She said, "Who could have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse sons? But now I've given birth to a son when he was old." Let us hear what the Spirit is speaking to God. So, let's look at this. This part in chapter 18, where Sarah laughs, we're often presented with this passage in a rather judgmental manner. This laughter of Sarah's is seen as a lack of faith, a piece of evidence that she has given up hope on the promise. And that may be the case. It may very well be the case. She had plenty of reason to be suspicious, to be incredulous, because she was like 89 or 90 at this point. The biology was no longer conducive to this happening. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous. Actually, it was pretty silly. This promise that Sarah would have a son naturally at that age. And Sarah is dealt with very harshly here. And it occurred to me a couple of things. First of all, it's really unfair to me that we cast Sarah in this light of faithlessness, and that her laugh is that of bitter irony, could never happen, is ridiculous. Especially if you turn back just one chapter. In chapter 17, the Lord comes to Abraham and reminds him of the promise, actually establishes the covenant that will be on Abraham and his descendants' side, will be expressed in the circumcision of all their sons, of themselves and their sons. And do you know what Abraham does when God says, Sarah will bear you a son? Do you know? He laughed. He didn't even laugh like the polite, tried to stifle it laughter like Sarah, where it says she laughed to herself. So we don't know if it was really out loud or just under her breath or just like, she didn't, outright laugh and ridicule. Abraham did. Abraham literally fell on his face laughing in front of God. And guess what? No judgment at all. No criticism. Nobody says, oh, that faithless Abraham, he laughed. Everybody says, that faithless Sarah, she laughed. She laughed as politely as she could to herself in her tent. Abraham laughed in God's face. And then, not only that, Abraham said, since we both know how stupid that promise is, can't you just fulfill the promise of my being the father of many nations through my son Ishmael? And God said, no. Listen again. This promise is going to come true through Sarah's. So, on the one hand, it's quite unfair to Sarah to cast her in such a harsh light when no such criticism is usually dealt to Abraham. And second of all, Sarah has very good reasons to be incredulous. Biologically speaking, this is not the way things work. It's not possible. And she has already suffered so much because of this promise to Abraham. I mean, we think, oh, Abraham, the faith of Abraham, he picked up and he moved, did what God said, even though God didn't give him the end in, the beginning, just said, go, I'll keep you posted. And things almost immediately went pear-shaped and they encountered famine and ended up, I love that phrase, pear-shaped. It's an Aussie thing. I picked it up on TV somewhere. Anyway, I love it. But things immediately, the plan goes sideways and they end up in Egypt twice. Abraham says to Sarah, so I'm afraid that this powerful man, in one case it was a Pharaoh and another king somewhere else, I'm afraid that this powerful man will kill me to steal you because you're so beautiful. So let's just go with we're brother and sister, okay? Which is not actually technically a lie, because they were. But that's another issue. he just says, let's leave out the important information that you're my wife. And he gains greatly both times at Sarah's expense. So Sarah has had every bit as much hardship, has endured everything that Abraham has, and arguably worse. And yet, God did not reassure her of the promise these several times that God did Abraham. We are led to believe that in the Abraham laughed incident in chapter 17, that she was not present. So it's easy, actually, when you look at the context to see why Sarah laughed. Furthermore, the Bible is full of examples where God is a prankster, where God tells hilarious jokes, makes things happen to people that should never be able to happen, that God does things in God's own unique way. And I don't think God is offended at our laughter. I don't think God was offended at Sarah's laughter. Because it was a joke, and you're supposed to laugh at jokes. Let me explain how I reached that conclusion. Every reading of Scripture is itself an interpretation. I'm going to read you part of this again, the exact same words, but I would like you to pay attention to the difference. See if you can detect difference in meaning when I just change the tone of voice in some places. So the visitors have come, fast forward. They said to Abraham, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Right here in the tent." Then one of the men said, "I will definitely return to you about this time next year. Then your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were both very old. Sarah was no longer menstruating, so Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "I'm no longer able to have children, and my husband's old." The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Me give birth at my age'? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? When I return to you about this time next year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied and said, I didn't laugh because she was frightened. But he said, "No, you laughed." When we read it that way, when we just play around with some tone of voice there, we realize what is and is not actually in the text. There is no judgment or condemnation of Sarah in the text. Did you hear it the first time, though? Is that how you've read it before? I'm going to be honest, that's how I read it the first time. You know, that's what comes to me. That's what came to me originally, and what it always typically sounds like to me. But when we read it differently, made me realize that judgment's not in there. I read that in. I read that in because that's the way it's always been framed for me before. I read that in probably because I have some baggage about being made fun of. when you hear something in the text, like judgment or condemnation, I want to challenge you to go back and read it again differently. Read it in a different tone of voice. See if you can make it sound different. If you can, that is pretty good evidence that the judgment and condemnation is not in the text. It's what you brought to the reading. That's the case here. There is no judgment of Sarah or her laughter. There is a response, but it could be read a number of ways. Whether it's simply a correction, a truth statement, an expression of delight at having made someone laugh, like we do when we tell a joke. You laughed, right? There's no judgment of Sarah in here. There's no judgment of her laughter, just like there was no judgment of Abraham's laughter, because it's completely understandable, because it was a funny joke, especially when we're reading it in Genesis and we know that a few chapters later it's going to actually happen. It's going to be even funnier because God made it happen, because that's how the pattern goes in Genesis. That's the point. God makes ridiculous things happen. God works through laughter. So God couldn't be offended at our laughter, because, after all, God is a jokester, and you're supposed to laugh at jokes. Thank you to all of you who have come here this morning or made it a point to tune in online. We know that you rearranged things. You intentionally came here to be with us in worship this morning, and we do not take that for granted. Thank you. We hope that it has been meaningful to you, that your experience has enabled you to draw closer to God, has given you something to think or laugh about. And if you are here and pondering, maybe God's calling you to something else, something different, maybe a response to God's call on your life is to accept Christ for the first time. Maybe you've done that before, but it's been a long time and you feel the need to reaffirm your faith. Or perhaps you are new here, you would like to find a new community of faith, a new place to belong as we work through this funny, messy life together. We don't promise to have all the answers, but we are committed to working it out together with a sense of humor. And so if you'd like to make any of those decisions, you can either come and share them with me this morning as we sing our closing song, or you can get in contact with me throughout the week. My information's on the front of the bulletin, and let me know, and I would be glad to be part of, helping you discern what this next step could be. So I invite you now, let us stand and sing.
Carry me
the holiday of Juneteenth and our celebration with our African American brothers and sisters, the heritage of our faith through that beloved community. And it's one of my mother's favorite songs. And so I wanted to shout that out to her today and to all of us. Diverse faith traditions. I hope that you go and have a wonderful week. I pray that you have plenty of opportunity for laughter, and that you would not be ashamed, but that you would celebrate that God laughs with you. Go in peace.